Shortly after 10 p.m. on September 8th, thousands of migrants detained in the Moria camp on the Greek island of Lesvos woke up to their surroundings on fire. The fires devastated much of the camp's formal enclosure and primary water infrastructure, with gale force winds spreading them over the fences and into a spillover site among olive groves neighboring the camp. As thousands scrambled to save themselves and their families, a campaign against refugees by far-right supporters broke out online. Many took to social media blaming Moria residents for planning the fires, pushing the Muslim invasion rhetoric, with some Greek conspiracy theorists and writers going as far as calling it Turkey's asymmetric warfare. These were far-right voices latching onto the incident to spread further anti-immigration sentiments and anti-Muslim hatred, moving the attention away from the conditions that led many to previously describe Moria as a concentration camp. And that's not surprising, as in the last few years, the Moria camp has become a symbol of Europe's increasingly hardened stance towards refugees. Since 2015, Lesvos and a number of surrounding Greek islands have become a common thoroughfare for refugees seeking to flee to Europe. In that year alone, more than 850,000 mainly Syrian and Afghan refugees arrived on the islands by boat. Many passed through Moria camp relatively easily, as Europe initially tolerated the movement of those seeking asylum. In fact, locals on some of the islands readily welcomed refugees, and those residing in Moria camp were actually allowed to travel back and forth between the camp and some local towns, including the capital of Lesvos, Mytilene. Many locals even volunteered to help rescue refugees who had arrived by boat. Some of those local volunteers were even nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for their rescue efforts in 2016. But since then, many European nations have changed their stances on refugees, resulting in large numbers of them being stuck on the islands as their asylum application processes became increasingly convoluted as the camps became increasingly overcrowded. As a result, Moria camp has been under constant scrutiny by leading NGOs for failing to provide refugees with adequate living conditions and their basic human rights. This has also coincided with a rise in anti-migrant sentiments among locals on the islands. In January this year, strikes and protests erupted on the Greek islands of Lesvos, Samos, and Chios as locals demanded that the government changed its policies on accepting refugees. Many protested against the poor living conditions refugees were forced to endure at the camps, and that they no longer wanted the islands to be prisons for human souls in the North Aegean. There were also calls to deport migrants to the mainland and other EU states on the basis that they had altered the local culture and prevented tourism. On February 3rd, hundreds of asylum seekers from Moria camp staged a peaceful protest against their poor living conditions and attempted to walk from the camp to Mytilene, only to be met with riot police and tear gas attacks. Even children were caught in the crossfire. During this time, unofficial roadblocks were built by residents in surrounding towns who actively denied migrants passage, and throughout February, there were multiple reports from NGOs and volunteers who had received threats from locals, with many cases of actual violence. Doctors Without Borders even put out a press release stating that it is unacceptable to target humanitarian aid and condemned all acts of violence and aggression against humanitarian workers, volunteers, and asylum seekers. Much of the violence continued into March as more refugees arrived on Lesvos, and more locals prevented them from entering the camps, with more unofficial roadblocks and attacks on asylum seekers and humanitarian workers alike. Meanwhile, news of the unrest was making headway among various far-right European groups. In fact, it was found that the #IStandWithGreece campaign was actually started by members of the Identitarian movement, a far-right group established in many EU nations that staunchly oppose immigration and have ideologies based in European ethno-nationalism. By March, a number of influencers and personalities from a variety of European far-right groups arrived in Lesvos and used their platforms to capitalize on rising tensions and anti-migrant sentiments among their followers across Europe. Some of them were even incarcerated for getting into fights with locals, and crew members on a docked Mare Liberum ship, which is an NGO dedicated to monitoring human rights on the Aegean, were even threatened by a group of men who poured gasoline on their decks.
And they're trying to get us to move the port. I think now there's...
One far-right British activist, Katie Hopkins, even referred to these far-right mobs who had travelled to Lesvos as soldiers of the cross holding the line against so-called foreign invaders in a now-deleted tweet. Moria had quickly become a flashpoint of far-right voices and local unrest, and it was against this backdrop that the fires broke out in the refugee camp on September 8th. Aid workers at the camp have reported to media outlets that the fires erupted after scuffles broke out between security personnel and refugees protesting against coronavirus quarantine measures. There were also unconfirmed reports from several refugees that the fires were actually started by far-right Greeks, with photos of gas canisters they claim were used to ignite them. The camp's first coronavirus case was confirmed a week prior to the fires, when a Somali man returned to the camp after being granted asylum and tested positive for the virus. Greek authorities consequently placed the entire camp on quarantine as infections spiked with 35 confirmed cases in the following days. Greek Migration Minister Notis Mitsotakis claims the incidents in Moria began with the asylum seekers because of the quarantine imposed, based on reports that some of those who had tested positive refused to be moved into isolation with their families. At the time of the fires, the camp is said to have been accommodating over 13,000 people, more than 4 times the number of people it was initially built to house. Refugees were forced to live in squalor, with limited living spaces and poor access to sanitation. Many resorted to using tarpaulins and makeshift shacks for shelter, while small fires were often lit for cooking and heating. So when coronavirus lockdowns were imposed, it was near impossible for residents to maintain safe hygienic standards and practice social distancing, and they were no longer allowed to travel to local towns for groceries and medical supplies. Resistance to the measures probably wasn't surprising, given the years of overcrowding and poor living conditions many had been subjected to. No casualties were recorded in the fire, but with nowhere to go, thousands of migrants were left homeless. Families have been sleeping on roadsides, supermarket parking lots, and fields across the island with no access to food, water, and much-needed sanitation. Since Friday, September 11th, refugees on the island have been protesting against the conditions they're now forced to endure. The temporary camp provided by authorities to host them has been described as a second hell. Refugees are now demanding that they be permitted to leave the island and continue their journeys into Europe. Some held handwritten signs with messages such as "We are human, we are not animals to live in forest." They once again attempted to march down a road leading to Mytilene when police fired tear gas rounds on them, blocked them off, and prevented them from leaving the area around the new construction site. Investigations into how the fires began are still ongoing, and many of the people who fled the fires are still unaccounted for, including most of the 35 who tested positive for the coronavirus. Greek authorities have refused mass transfers of refugees off the island, with Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis announcing the building of a new and permanent migrant reception centre on Lesvos in an attempt to revamp the country's policies of handling migrant arrivals. But his statements come amid rising animosity from locals who no longer want migrants to remain on the island.